Research methods class, Psych 290. This is wrong. This should be 4 hours. This is a 4 hour class. This is me. I am Bruce Bradway. This is where I live, Lost Nation, Iowa. It's about 50 miles south of where they filmed Field of Dreams in Dyersville, Iowa. So if you watch that movie, you'll see what it looks like where I am. Normally, I live in a cornfield, but this year everybody around me planted soybeans, so I live in a soybean field. This is my telephone number if you need to get a hold of me. I will have office hours Monday through Thursday at different times. If you cannot meet me or Zoom in at this number, at these times, then just email me and I can turn the Zoom on at any time. I have it on fairly frequently um, for you, and then I've got a colleague that is looking for a job. I think he's looking for a job, but not at Dene College. Anyway, so let's talk about what requirements uh, there are for this class. This is the textbook. It is free. It's online, I hope. If you can figure out how to get hold of it, I'm sure you guys are better at that than I am. It's online. This KPU is a college in university in British Columbia. It's Kwajalein Polytechnic University, and that's where the lead author is from, Jangiani. I had a friend. Every other year, I would go to Vancouver for a series of seminars in psychology, and he taught at KPU. So I have several things that have the KPU symbol on them. Anyway, the Canadians, interesting people. Okay, so there are three things you need to do to pass the class. One of them is that you need to take quizzes for each chapter, and I've got just weekly quizzes here, and there will be weekly quizzes. This week, however, because we cover two chapters, there are actually 20 questions on this week's quiz. I haven't put it online yet, but I will put it on later on this evening. So that'll be about 130 points. During the semester, I want you to write a research proposal, but we'll do it incrementally so that you can see how it's done. You can see how sometimes good ideas, good topics are you can't do research on them because they are too nebulous. The questions aren't you can't quantify them or you can't qualify them. So there's nothing to measure. So the first week, what we're going to do is look at the research topic, that any topic that you come up with. I will discuss with you whether this actually works. If it works, then you're good to go. We'll have to talk about what the unit of observation is. Unit of observation has to do with how you're measuring the topic that you're dealing with, and this gets into a lot of different ways of looking at things. Week 2, we'll look at the research question. That is from your topic. You have come up with a specific question. Week 3, we'll look at the supporting literature, which is one of the things that you have to do to find out if you can actually measure your research question. Then we'll do the hypothesis and null hypothesis. Hypothesis states how restates your research question. And the null hypothesis states it in a negative way, because in science we're always looking to refute what we think is the way the world works. Refute our hypotheses, and that's known as a null hypothesis. And then we'll talk about the population of your research question, and then we'll get into the rest of that. Okay. And as you can see, we're going to do it incrementally. And I will be discussing with you whether this works or whether it doesn't work. You can do research on anything on the reservation, or it can be off the reservation. It can be, world peace if you can figure out how to measure it. Whatever, whatever. Okay, so that'll be 200 points. So that's what, 330 points, and then we will have weekly discussions. I already know what I'm going to ask you. Um, you need to be careful if you are planning on using AI, artificial intelligence, or Chat GPT to write your papers, or to write your proposal, or to write anything. These guys are not very good. Uh, and the reason is because they don't know who you are. And of course, my idea is that I need to make you think. The more you can think, the more you can figure out a problem. The more you can come up with a solution for a problem in the future. If you let Chat GPT or artificial intelligence always figure out the solutions to your problems, then half the solutions they come up with are failures. So you got to be really careful with that stuff. Besides, I want you to think. Anyway, so, uh-oh, I seem to have put something extra in there. This needs to come out. Okay, so this exam thing will not be in there. Let me see if I can get rid of it now. No, I can't. Okay, well anyway, so that's wrong. We're going to use the quizzes instead of the the rest of it. That was an old textbook that I didn't get rid of. Okay, and we've already talked about ChatGPT and how I feel that it's this negative. I think that we are smarter than Silicon Valley robots. So, Siri, what can I do next? Well, let's turn this off and go to the lecture. Okay, so we're going to start the lecture now, and I'm going to cover two chapters today. The first one is the science of psychology. I'm going to start off on a fairly negative note. And the reason I'm going to start off on a fairly negative note is to show you that all research is not good. Some of it is bad. Some of it is just way, way off. And that's what we're going to start off with. We're going to start off with um, research from 1923. Now, one of the things that you need to remember about 1923 is there was this huge movement in the United States that started in the late 19th century that had to do with some people are smarter than others. That's when intelligence tests first came to the United States. And the idea was that we were bringing people into the United States, immigrants into the United States, who weren't as smart as other people. And so we didn't want those people. We only wanted the really smart people to come to the United States um, and make their millions and millions of dollars. So there was what they called a eugenics movement. You meaning good, genics meaning good genes. These people represented good genes. So, I mean, the whole idea behind aristocracies is that theoretically these people are smarter than everybody else. That's why they get to be in charge. But of course, in the United States, we refuted that with the Declaration of Independence and whatnot. Of course, we were focusing on select individuals when we wrote the Declaration of Independence. It certainly didn't include indigenous people, and it also didn't include people from Africa. We were only talking about the people we liked, mostly Western Europeans at the time. And that also didn't include the Spanish, as weird as that may seem, since the Spanish were controlling the whole southern portion of of what eventually became the United States, including Mexico and almost all of South America, Central and South America. But we didn't like them for various reasons. I'm talking about the United States government. mainly because they were Catholic, and of course that religion was denigrated by the Protestant religion, and the Protestant religion was there. There were, of course, Catholic churches in the United States at the time, but not nearly as many as we have today. Okay, so let's start with this research. Now, like I told you before, uh, this was part of the eugenics movement, and this is research that was done by Thomas R. Garth. In 1923, it's a comparison of the intelligence of Mexican and mixed and full-blood Indian children, and it appeared in the Psychological Review, which was the 30th volume in 1923. So the Psychological Review started in the 19th century, and I got it out of the library, as you can see. In the 1920s, Thomas Garth conducted research comparing the intelligence of Mexican, Pueblo, mixed blood, and Navajo and Apache children. So he was looking at 5 different groups. He was looking at Mexican children, Pueblo children, mixed blood children, Navajo children, and Apache children. The test he administered was the National Intelligence Test Series A, and it was administered at the Chalaco Indian School in Oklahoma for the Pueblo, mixed blood, Navajo, and Apache children. The Mexican children he found around the Southwest in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. And he tested Mexican children wherever he could find them. Not surprising. Oh, this is a picture of Navajo children. This isn't in Chalaco, of course. This is in somewhere in the Southwest. And these are Pueblo children. Not surprisingly, Garth's results show that the more European blood the children had, the more intelligent they were. Now, remember, this was the movement that was taking place in the United States. The government was trying to show that Western Europeans were smarter than Eastern or Southern Europeans, who were Catholics, by the way. Northern Europeans were Lutherans, of course. Western Europeans were primarily Protestants. And there was this undercurrent of religion taking place, and this eugenics movement. So the idea was that we needed to stop immigration coming into the United States because we were diluting our population with people with intellectual deficits. We were getting too many people from Southern and Eastern Europe. So guess what happened? In 1924, they passed laws stopping immigration coming into the United States. They had already stopped immigration coming into the United States in the 1880s for people from Asia. So we didn't have people from Japan, China coming into the United States. And of course, Korea was controlled by the Japanese at this point. I think it may have been the Chinese, but we weren't getting people coming in to the United States from Asia. And of course, Garth's research proved that indigenous children, full-blooded Indian children, scored lower on the intelligence scale. The Mexican Americans that he was talking about, or the Mexican children that he was talking about, of course, had some degree of European blood. The mixed blood individuals were individuals that had a European parent. One of their parents was European, and they had the higher IQ scores or intelligence scores on their intelligence scale. And of course, this fit with the common narrative of the government eugenics movement of the time, which was no surprise. So yada yada yada. The government was happy, and his research was accepted. Why? Because it supported it supported the political movement that was taking place at the time. Research is always pure, and the answer is, of course not. We just saw some research that was fairly flawed. Research can have flawed hypotheses, it can have manipulated statistics and inaccurate conclusions. Psychological research is only as accurate as the structure and interpretation of the researchers. And negative research is rarely published, only positive results. So if Garth had come up with results that didn't agree with the common idea, he wouldn't have published it. And maybe he did. Maybe he did the test 3 times, and this is the only time it came out the way he wanted it to, so this is what he published. Is that ethical? Well, not really, but I mean, that's the way science works sometimes. People don't want to show that they had bad ideas or that their ideas were inaccurate. They want people to think that they are smarter than everybody else. It's kind of like the Big Bang Theory. If you ever watched that television show, the scientists on that show wanted everybody to think they were smarter than everybody else. Math, chemistry, physics, the hard sciences are always looking for laws that don't change. They are seeking an absolute answer so that gravity is always constant and H2O always yields water. That's what the hard sciences are looking for. That's STEM. But humanity is constantly evolving, and sometimes the changes are quite abrupt. And this is an example. These are people at a picnic in the 1910s, and these are people at a party in the 1920s. And as you can see, the hairdos are different. The outfits are different. Their looks on their face are very different. And of course, the language changes. Their hairstyles are these women that probably never cut their hair in their lives, and they pin them up, and here are ladies with bobbed hair, and that's what they used to call the Marcel wave. Anyway, so the whole point is that STEM is looking for laws that are absolute, but humanity, there are no absolute laws. There is, and it is an argument referred to as absolutism. And of course, I just had this huge argument with the people from STEM. They were saying that, well, we can put STEM and psychology together, and we'll come up with the same thing. With the same ideas, and I was saying, no, you can't do that because there are no absolutes in psychology, and that's what you're looking for. H2O always yields water. Gravity is fairly constant around the Earth, which is not exactly true. There's a place in the Indian Ocean, in the middle of the Indian Ocean, that has lower gravity than every place else on the Earth. I just read that. The best that we can do in psychological research is to show an accurate snapshot of what we see today. A quick example is that the overreaching debate in psychology when I first started studying in the discipline in the 1970s was whether women should work outside the home. Divorce was illegal in most states in the United States in the 1970s, and only about 25% of women worked outside the home. Today, that has been reversed. Only about 25% are stay-at-home moms, and there is a movement going on in the United States right now called trad wives, trad standing for traditional wives, and they are trying to look like women from the 1950s, always cooking meals, having dinner on the table at 6 o'clock in the evening, and always looking attractive for their husbands and wearing skirts and dresses. So it's a very curious movement taking place in the United States, and of course she's supposed to represent a trad wife with curlers in her hair. The point is that human society is perpetually changing. If you don't believe it, just look at the mullet. This is what people did look like back in the 1980s and 1990s. These Viper sunglasses. My grandson has a pair of Viper sunglasses, but I can assure you he doesn't have a mullet. He's only 11, but he has a haircut just like almost everybody else at his school. As a social scientist, ethically you must follow the scientific method and ignore social pressure. Garth didn't in 1923, and now to read his research makes him look foolish at best, as if he sported a mullet. So he does look kind of foolish. I don't think anyone would agree with his research. I'm probably the only one that has talked about Garth's research. I hope I am, because it is really, really flawed. But for 1923, he was doing what everybody else was doing in the United States. He was agreeing with everyone else in 1923, since we were pushing to stop immigration. The U.S. government was, or there were some people in the United States that were pushing to stop immigration. 60% of all the people that immigrated to the United States immigrated to the United States between 1880 and 1920. And the reason the flood of immigration stopped in 1920 was because of the eugenics movement and because of this group of individuals who had, luckily, they had immigrated earlier, so they could come into the United States. They didn't want anybody else coming into the United States. And of course, we're having immigration arguments now. Uh, one side, and there's always a conservative and a more liberal political movement taking place. Anyway, the methods of acquiring knowledge can be broken down into 5 categories, each with its own strengths and weaknesses. The first is intuition. Authority is the second. The third is rationalism. The fourth is empiricism, and the last is scientific method. And as you go down the list, it gets more and more scientific, or it's supported more with statistics. When we use our intuition, we're relying on our guts, our emotions, and/or our instincts to guide us. Rather than examining facts or using rational thought, intuition involves believing what feels true. This feels right to me. That's my intuition, and therefore I'm going to go with that. The problem with relying on intuition is that our intuitions can be wrong because they are driven by cognitive and motivational biases rather than logical reasoning or scientific evidence. And there are a lot of people that do politics this way. They just feel like this is right. Perhaps one of the most common methods of acquiring knowledge is through authority. This method involves accepting new ideas because some authority figure states that these ideas are true. The problem with using authority to obtain knowledge is that they may be wrong. They may just be using their intuition to arrive at their conclusions, and they may have their own reasons to mislead you. Nevertheless, much of the information we acquire is through authority because we don't have time to question and independently research every piece of knowledge we learn through authority. But we can learn to evaluate the credentials of authority figures, to evaluate the methods they use to arrive at their conclusions, and evaluate whether they have any reasons to mislead us. And this is known as skepticism, and we need to have skepticism in just about every piece of information that we accept. We need to be skeptical. We need to make sure that the information that we are adhering to is as accurate as it possibly can. Authority figures. Should we trust people that have expertise? Should you trust me? I've been teaching since 1990. I've been teaching college since 1991. I got my first teaching license in 1971 when I was in the military. So I wasn't teaching. Anyway, so the point is you need to be skeptical about every piece of information that you get. The individuals may have a hidden agenda. They may be trying to get you to vote the way that they want you to vote, or to influence you in one way or the other. I have no idea what the hot dog has to do with higher authority. Rationalism involves using logic and reasoning to acquire new knowledge. Using this method, premises are stated and logical rules are followed to arrive at sound conclusions. The problem with this method is that if the premises are wrong or there is an error in logic, then the conclusion will not be valid. Also, unless formally trained in the rules of logic, it is easy to make an error. Nevertheless, if the premises are correct and logical rules are followed appropriately, then this is sound means of acquiring knowledge. Rationalism, figuring out yourself. And that's fine. You can do that as long as everything that you think, everything that you are using as fact, actually is factual, actually is accurate. Empiricism involves acquiring knowledge through observation and experience. For centuries, people believed the world is flat because it appears to be flat. When you look out, everything is flat, unless you're looking at a ship sailing away from you. Then it disappears. From the bottom disappears before the top disappears, which makes it look like the world is curved, which is true. It is curved. Visual illusions that trick our senses illustrate the problems with relying on empiricism alone to derive knowledge. Sometimes we get things wrong. Let me give you a quick example. I was living in Lubbock, Texas. And if you've ever been to Lubbock, Texas, you know there's lots of tumbleweeds. And so every fall, the tumbleweeds dry up and then they break off and they start rolling down the road. And sometimes you get whole herds of tumbleweeds rolling down the road. Well, this one day I was looking out the window. This is in Lubbock, Texas, when I was stationed at Reese Air Force Base in Lubbock, Texas. Looking out the window, and here comes this giant tumbleweed rolling down the road. And the road was about half a mile away. And here this tumbleweed looks like a normal-sized tumbleweed. And I was thinking to myself, if that's a half a mile away, that tumbleweed's really, really big. But it looked the right size. That was the weird part. It didn't look like a big tumbleweed. It just looked like a normal tumbleweed rolling down. Was it closer to me? What in the world am I looking at? And this thing just kept rolling along at the same speed as all the other tumbleweeds. If it was big, wouldn't it be rolling slower? The wind was blowing pretty hard. It does in Lubbock, Texas. And it looks like it's rolling down the road. And so I'm watching this thing roll along, and there was a house out there. And the house is only a one-story house. And by golly, that tumbleweed hit that house and flipped over it. It kept going down the road. There was a truck coming, and that truck had to pull off the road because that tumbleweed was so big. It was actually an oversized tumbleweed. So sometimes visual illusions can really fool you. I just thought it was a normal tumbleweed, and it was closer to me than it actually was. Anyway, so the tumbleweed that ate the truck and almost knocked the house down. We are limited in what we can experience and observe, and our senses can deceive us, and just like my senses deceived me with the tumbleweed. Moreover, our prior experiences can alter the way that we perceive events, and of course, I hadn't grown up with tumbleweeds, so I had never seen them massed together like this. It was kind of weird because that night we had a windstorm, and there was a dry lake about 2 or 3 miles away from base housing, and these Russian thistles is what tumbleweeds actually are. The whole lake was covered with these things. And so when the wind started blowing, it started breaking them off. They were dried up and they were breaking off. And some of the houses in base housing were tumbleweeded in. We couldn't get out. We couldn't go out the doors because there were masses of tumbleweed in front of the door. We couldn't push through them. They're sticky, they're thistles. So they have stickers on them. It's really weird. I hadn't grown up with them, so I'd never seen them massing together or getting mashed into a house and can't get out. We had to crawl out the window on the opposite side. Wind was blowing from the west. We had to crawl out a window on the east. It's weird. It was so weird. I mean, I've been snowed in before, but I've never been tumbleweeded in before. Nevertheless, empiricism is at the heart of the scientific method. Science relies on observations. But not just any observations. Science relies on structured observations, which is known as systematic empiricism. And of course, empiricism is one thing, but systematic empiricism is something totally different. And that is part of the scientific method. And the next method of knowing is, of course, the scientific method. It's a process of systematically collecting and evaluating evidence to test ideas and answer questions. While scientists may use intuition, authority, rationalism, and empiricism to generate new ideas, they don't stop there. Scientists go a step further by using systematic empiricism to make careful observations under various controlled conditions in order to test their ideas, and they use rationalism to arrive at valid conclusions. While the scientific method is the most likely of all the methods to produce valid knowledge, like all methods of acquiring knowledge, it also has its drawbacks. One major problem is that it is not always feasible to use a scientific method. This method can require considerable time and resources. Another problem with the scientific method is that it cannot be used to answer all questions. As described in the following section, the scientific method can only be used to address empirical questions. It has to be something that can be measured. If it can't be measured, it can't be tested. This book and your research methods course are designed to provide you with an in-depth examination of how psychologists use the scientific method to advance our understanding of human behavior and the mind. There you go. Blow that kid's brain up. There you go. Some people are surprised to learn that psychology is a science. They generally agree that astronomy, biology, and chemistry are sciences, but wonder what psychology has in common with these other fields. What the sciences have in common is a general approach to understanding the natural world. Psychology is a science because it takes the same general approach to understanding one aspect of the natural world, and that is human behavior. But still, STEM doesn't have a P in it. And the reason STEM doesn't have a P in it is because psychology cannot function with absolutes. So there are no absolutes in psychology because we're talking about human behavior. Human behavior is never the same from one individual to the next. And people evolve and ideas evolve, just like the mullet. People don't, well, I guess the mullet is coming back. But before 1980, I guess, there was no mullet. But now, of course, well, we had it in the 1980s and it seems to be making a comeback. But in the future, the mullet will not be something that people wear. Everything changes. The more they stay the same. The general scientific approach has three fundamental features, and this is according to Stanovich in 2010. Systematic empiricism, empirical questions, and public knowledge. Empiricism refers to learning based on observation, and scientists learn about the natural world systematically by carefully planning, making, recording, and analyzing observations of it. Logical reasoning and even creativity play important roles in science too, but scientists are unique in their insistence on checking their ideas about the way the world is against their systematic observations. Empirical questions are questions about the way the world actually is and therefore can be answered by systematically observing it. There are many interesting and important questions that are not empirically testable that science is not in a position to answer. Among these questions about values, whether things are good or bad, just or unjust, or beautiful or ugly, and how the world ought to be, these are questions that you cannot answer because they require value judgments. It was the same thing that Garth ran into. He should not have measured those individuals and said empirically that somebody is smarter than somebody else. He shouldn't have done that. That was not an empirical question. For example, the question of whether criminal behavior has a genetic basis is an empirical question, but the question of what actions ought to be considered illegal is not. That is for the courts to decide, and it's not an empirical question. It is especially important for researchers in psychology to be mindful of this distinction between empirical questions and non empirical questions. And of course, this has to do with the secret documents that were found in Trump's Mar-a-Lago uh, estate, and this guy's trying to rob you. So is this wrong? Well, empirically, we can talk about his genes, but we can't. I don't think we're going to check Trump's genes and determine whether he is a criminal or not. We're going to look at what he has done. After asking their empirical questions, making their systematic observations, and drawing their conclusions, scientists publish their work. This usually means writing an article for publication in a professional journal, in which they put their research question in the context of previous research, describe in detail the methods they used to answer their question, and clearly present their results and conclusions. Increasingly, scientists are opting to publish their work in open access journals, in which the articles are freely available to all scientists and non-scientists alike. This important choice allows publicly funded research to create public knowledge that is truly public. Publication is an essential feature of science for two reasons. One is that science is a social process, a large-scale collaboration among many researchers distributed across both time and space. Our current scientific knowledge of most topics is based on many different studies and conducted by many different researchers who have shared their work publicly over many years. The second is that publication allows science to be self-correcting. Individual scientists understand that despite their best efforts, their methods can be flawed and their conclusions incorrect. Publication allows others in the scientific community to detect and correct these errors so that over time, scientific knowledge increasingly reflects the way the world actually is. Pseudoscience refers to activities and beliefs that are claimed to be scientific by their proponents, and many appear to be scientific at first glance, but are not. A set of beliefs or activities can be said to be pseudoscientific if A, its adherents claim or imply that it is scientific, but B, it lacks one or more of the three features of science. For instance, it might lack systematic empiricism. Either there is no relevant scientific research or there is relevant scientific research, but it is ignored. It might also lack public knowledge. People who promote the beliefs of activities might claim to have conducted scientific research but never published their research in a way that allows others to evaluate it. And of course, we ran into this with these curious cures that people came up with during the pandemic. And of course, people were hoping for something, some miracle, some magic pill that would keep them from being killed by COVID-19. And and people were making these pseudoscientific claims. At one point, Trump was a president at the time, and at one point he actually said that, what did he say? He said that why can't we spray? We know that disinfectant kills the coronavirus, so why can't we just spray that down in people's lungs and kill off the bacteria? Of course, you can't do that because, well, there's lots of reasons why you can't do that. For one thing, the disinfectant is toxic and would destroy the lung tissue, and that's just silly. Why in the world would you destroy the lung tissue? Ah. And then there were a couple, chloroquine was a drug that for some reason, the president decided that chloroquine would cure COVID-19. And he said, well, it works, it was really kind of interesting because there was a guy in DeWitt. DeWitt's a town that's about 15 miles away. Anyway, he was screaming that he couldn't get chloroquine in the emergency room because he was afraid. He wanted to take it prophylactically. He wanted to take it so he wouldn't get COVID. As weird as that sounds, but there was no proof that, of course, that chloroquine actually worked. And then there was what was it? There were drugs for that people with lupus take. And they ran out of this stuff because, uh, well, anyway, people were pushing a lot of strange ideas and making a lot of money. By golly, and that wasn't science; it was pseudoscience. So there was a fight going on between the religious right and the CDC, Anthony Fauci. There are at least three reasons why we are concerned with pseudoscience. One is that learning about pseudoscience helps bring the fundamental features of science and their importance into sharper focus. A second is that many pseudoscientific beliefs are widely held and are promoted on the internet, on television, and in books and magazines. And we saw this over and over again with COVID-19. One of the things that you may not know is that I worked in medicine for 30 years. So this was really important to me. It was really important to me that we get this right. I had been through one other pandemic. It was the AIDS epidemic when the AIDS first hit the streets in the late 70s and early 80s. I was working in the hospital, and that was the first pandemic that I ever dealt with. But these are these are things you're trying to keep people alive, and they're just accepting anything that they hear. Is really kind of weird. You can't touch somebody with AIDS, that kind of stuff, that kind of silly stuff. But we were trying to keep ourselves safe at that time, so we started wearing gloves. We didn't wear gloves before when we handled patients or patients uh, anything that came out of the patient. Uh, we weren't wearing masks. It was weird. My first autopsy I didn't wear any gloves. I didn't have a mask on or anything. As weird as that sounds. Okay. So we believe whatever we hear, strangely enough. Learning what makes them pseudoscientific can help us to identify and evaluate such beliefs and practices when we encounter them. We have to be skeptical about just about everything. A third reason is many pseudosciences purport to explain some aspect of human behavior and mental processes, and is important for students of psychology to distinguish their own field clearly from this pseudopsychology. And of course, you hear people talk about pseudopsychology all the time. Anyway, we need to be as scientific as we possibly can. The three goals of science, first of all, is to describe. This goal is achieved by making careful observations. The second goal is to predict. Once we have observed with some regularity that two behaviors or events are systematically related to one another, we can use that information to predict whether an event or behavior will occur in a certain situation. And the last is to explain. This goal involves determining the causes of the behavior, which is what we are trying to do. Scientific research is often classified as being either basic or applied. Basic research in psychology is conducted primarily for the sake of achieving a more detailed and accurate understanding of human behavior without necessarily trying to address any particular practical problem. And when you start reading research, you'll realize that we do a lot of research with rats and pigeons and mice and a lot of strange things. That's mostly basic research. We're just trying to find out how these creatures react, and we can possibly interpolate how humans might react to the same situation. That's basic research. Applied research is conducted primarily to address some practical problem. Although the distinction between basic and applied research is convenient, it is not always clear cut. And of course, applied research would be if we were trying to figure out, if people with bipolar disorder, no, not bipolar, borderline personality disorder show symptoms of depression or symptoms of mania, in which case, of course, they would be diagnosed as bipolar or something. Some people wonder whether the scientific approach to psychology is necessary. Can we not reach the same conclusions based on common sense or intuition? We all have intuitive beliefs about people's behavior, thoughts, and feelings, and these beliefs are collectively referred to as folk psychology. Although much of our folk psychology is probably reasonably accurate, it is clear that much of it is not. And of course, this is all folk psychology. That's all men think about, and this is all that women think about. Maybe this woman likes beer and football. And yeah, well, he's got sex 3 times, doesn't he? Anyway. Myths of popular psychology that people use only 10% of their brain power. This isn't true. We use 100% of our brains, not 10%. Most people experience a midlife crisis in their 40s or 50s. Some people don't experience a midlife crisis at all throughout their whole lives. Some people wait until their 60s and 70s before they have their midlife crisis, or if they have a midlife crisis. Students learn best when teaching styles are matched to their learning styles. This is not always true. Low self-esteem is a major cause of psychological problems. It can cause psychological problems, but I wouldn't say it was a major cause. Psychiatric admissions and crimes increase during full moons. I've worked in emergency rooms, and I can tell you that usually during a full moon, the emergency room is hopping. It's so is this true or not? Probably not. It's probably about the same. We had hopping nights when there was no moon, and we had hopping nights when it was a quarter moon. So, yeah. We tend to rely on mental shortcuts, what psychologists refer to as heuristics, in forming and maintaining our beliefs. If a belief is widely shared, especially if it is endorsed by experts, and it makes intuitive sense, we tend to assume that it is true. This is compounded by the fact that we tend to focus on cases that confirm our intuitive beliefs and not on cases that disconfirm them. This is called confirmation bias. We're always looking to find out that we are smarter than everybody else, that we are correct. We don't want to find out that we're wrong, and this is known as confirmation bias. So if I thought that the sky was always pink, I would only look at the sky in the morning and in the evening when it was actually pink. And that would be confirmation bias. I would keep my eyes closed during the afternoon or whatever because I didn't want to see a sky that wasn't pink. We also hold incorrect beliefs in part because it would be nice if they were true. And sadly, that is true as well. Scientists, especially psychologists, understand they are just as susceptible as anyone else to intuitive but incorrect beliefs. This is why they cultivate an attitude of skepticism. We always need to be skeptical. This is how we get through from one day to the next, is by looking at things and trying to determine if this is right or whether this is wrong. Just because Joe Biden said it or just because Donald Trump said it doesn't mean that it is always correct. We have to be skeptical. Being skeptical means pausing to consider alternatives and to search for evidence, especially systematically collected empirical evidence, when there is enough at stake to justify doing so. And of course, this has to do with climate change. This is a climate change denier. Yesterday, he said it was all a hoax. Today, he says it's too costly to do anything about it. And tomorrow, he says it's too late to do anything. There's often not enough evidence to fully evaluate a belief or claim. Scientists also cultivate a tolerance for uncertainty. They accept that there are many things that they simply do not know. Although this kind of uncertainty can be problematic from a practical perspective, it is exciting from a scientific perspective. If we do not know the answer to an interesting and empirically testable question, science may be able to provide the answer. Scientific research in psychology is generally conducted by people with doctoral degrees, usually the Doctor of Philosophy or a PhD, and master's degrees in psychology in related fields, often supported by research assistants with bachelor's degrees or other relevant training. Some work for government agencies, national associations, nonprofit organizations, or in the private sector. However, the majority are college and university faculty who often collaborate with their graduate and undergraduate students. And the reason I have these three people here is because I want you to see the difference between one robe and the other. This individual has a bachelor's degree, and we can tell by the fact that she has a mortarboard. She doesn't have a, what do they call that thing? This is a hood. That's what it is. It's a hood, and it's a specific color. That the color of the hood tells you what institution somebody graduated from. And she doesn't have a hood, so that means that she has a bachelor's degree. This guy has a master's degree, and I can tell that he has a master's degree because he has a hood. He also has these long sleeves. These are actually pockets, as weird as that seems. He has pockets. And so I know that he has a master's degree because of his hood and his long pockets. She has no pockets and she has no hood. This individual has a PhD. And the reason I know he has a PhD is because that's what this panel is all about. This velvet panel in front. He also has a hood that tells everybody what college he graduated from, and he has these three velvet stripes on the side, on his sleeves on each side. And we know it's a PhD, and we also know it's a PhD in the social sciences because it's blue. Social science has a blue is colored blue. So if we had him turn around, just like this guy's got a PhD as well. But if we looked at his hood, we could tell what institution he came from. I have a PhD, Dr. Russ has a PhD, and Dr. Barber has a PhD. Dr. Begay, Marilyn Begay, worked here before. Now she no longer works here, but she also has a PhD. Dr. Barber has a PsyD, which is a Doctor of Psychology, whereas Dr. Russ and Dr. Begay and I all have PhDs. What does that all mean? It just means that we have a doctorate in something. And if you looked at our hoods, then you could tell what institution that we came from. Maybe or maybe not. There's hundreds of schools in the country that award doctorates, and it's kind of hard to know them all. Anyway, so I think this is Harvard, if I'm not mistaken, and I have no idea what this is. It's really kind of weird because if you get a degree, and my wife has a master's degree in business, and this lining right here, this individual has a master's degree in education, And the reason I know that is because this is light blue. His is social science, so it's dark blue. If he had an EDD, which is a Doctor of Education, they would have a light blue panel in front. As weird as that sounds. Okay, so we know he has a PhD because of this velvet panel and these three velvet stripes. He can also wear a really weird hat, different from the mortarboard, but that's, it all depends on the institution. And sometimes different institutions will have different color robes. Instead of black, it could be red, or I think Dr. Robinson has a yellow one from an institution in southern Iowa. But it's always interesting to see what colors are coming out. It's graduation day is always kind of fun because everybody's got a different hood, well, yeah, and a different colored robe on. And I haven't been to one in 5 years, so, and I've got my regalia is upstairs. I'll probably never wear it again. Although some researchers are trained and licensed as clinicians for mental health work, especially those who conduct research in clinical psychology, the majority are not. Instead, they have expertise in one or more of the many other subfields of psychology: behavioral neuroscience, cognitive psychology, developmental psychology, personality psychology, social psychology, industrial organizational psychology. There's just a ton of them. Dr. Russ's degree is in, her doctorate is in educational psychology, mine's in general psychology, and Dr. Barber's Psych D is in forensic psychology. And Dr. Begay, her degree is in clinical psychology. Doctoral level researchers might be employed to conduct research full-time, or like many college and university faculty members, to conduct research in addition to teaching classes and serving their institution and community in other ways. And Diné College was not a research institution. Now, over the last 3 or 4 years, they've decided to promote research. So there will be faculty members doing research. I'm not sure if anybody in psychology is going to do any research. I'm guessing Dr. Barber might. He has a new doctorate. But Dr. Russ's doctorate is in she got hers in the early 2000s. My doctorate is from 2012. Psychology is a scientific study of behavior and mental processes, but it is also the application of scientific research to help people, organizations, and communities function better. By far the most common and widely known application is the clinical practice of psychology, or head shrinkers, and that's the reason I've got Beetlejuice with his head shrinking. They call them head shrinkers. The diagnosis and treatment of psychological disorders and related problems. Between 50 and 60% of all psychologists are clinical psychologists. Actually, the figures are 55 to 65% of all psychologists are clinical psychologists. So the cognitive psychologists, all of these guys, a much smaller percentage. And the IO psychology, like my colleague. Many of the clinical psychology community have argued that their field has not paid enough attention to scientific research. The reality is we can't say anything in psychology unless somebody has researched it and proven that this is true. I can come up with all kinds of strange statements to make, but unless I have the research to back it up, it's just my intuition. It's just not accurate. We can't be sure it's accurate. It is important for scientific research in clinical psychology to continue, but it is also important for clinicians who never conduct a scientific study themselves to be scientifically literate so that they can read and evaluate new research and make treatment decisions based on the best available evidence. This is really, really important. Whether you plan on doing research in the future, you need to be able to read research. You need to be able to understand research in order to pick up new ideas. And of course, she's reading a book and he's going, it's prehistoric Googling. Okay, that was the end of chapter 1. Let's go into chapter 2. We're going to talk about the overview of the scientific method. The researchers formulate a research question, conduct an empirical study designed to answer the question, analyze the resulting data, draw conclusions about the answer to the question, and publishes the results so that they can become part of the research literature. That's how it works. Because the research literature is one of the primary sources of new research questions, this process can be thought of as a cycle, and this is a scientific method cycle. You observe something, you think, oh, wait a minute, that's a good question. And then you form a hypothesis, you form a way to do an experiment, you get conclusions from your experiment, and then you publish your results. I have done scientific research only once, and the reason, well, I'm not a research psychologist, but I had to do original research in order to get my PhD. That was what my dissertation was about, original research that I did. At the time, I was living on the Fort Belknap Reservation up in Montana, up in northern Montana, up on the Canadian border. And I decided that I wanted to do research looking at that population. And since everybody was doing research looking at, this is back in the early 2000s, and since everybody else was going, well, there's a drug problem on the reservation, there's an alcohol problem on the reservation, there's a domestic violence problem on the reservation. Everybody was seeing all these negative things, and I had all these friends, and I had I was going to powwows, and everybody was so friendly, and everybody was so nice. I said to myself, why in the world would I perpetuate a negative stereotype? Why don't I research something positive? So what I decided to do was and at the time, on other reservations, not on the Fort Belknap reservation, but on other reservations, they were having problems with suicide. So I wanted to show that the population was resilient. And so that's what I did my research on. I tried to do it on something that was positive. I needed to show that this population was resilient. For one thing, they had survived from the 17th century to the 18th century to the 19th century to the 20th century, and they were fairly intact as a tribal group. There were actually two different tribal groupings on the Fort Belknap Reservation, the Nakota people and the Ahane people. One speaks an Algonquian language and the other speaks a Siouan language, but they were able to survive. And many of my friends had done drugs, and they had been alcoholics earlier in their careers, earlier in their lives, and now they had survived. Now they tried to teach their children not to do it. And this was the resilience I wanted to show. So there you go. That was my observation. These people are too nice of people. This is too positive a situation to look at something negative, to look at the percentage of them that are alcoholics today, are drug addicts today, uh, are imbued in domestic violence today. I wanted to show that they had resilience and that they would survive into the future. So that was my observation. So I came up with a research question. The people of the Fort Belknap Reservation have resilience. So my hypothesis, I had several hypotheses. One of the hypotheses looked at age. Or just because you're older, does that mean you're more resilient? Another had to do with education. The more education you had, the more resilient you were. I wanted to see if males were more or females were more resilient than males because that's what the literature seemed to state, not about indigenous people, but about all people. I also looked at the level of trauma that they had suffered in their lives. Did the greater the trauma in their lives, did that uh, lessen the probability that they would be resilient? And the last had to do with culture, and I had to measure their level of culture. And the stronger their culture, did that mean that they were more resilient? Those were my hypotheses. So, well, as we're going to find out, resilience was my dependent variable, and my independent variable were those other five factors. So then I did my experiment. I put a survey together, looking at all those different things. They told me their age, they told me their gender, they told me their education level. I measured their trauma and I measured their resilience. I had an instrument that measured their resilience and I measured their level of spirituality, not spirituality, level of cultural awareness. I had instruments for all those things, and that was my experiment. And my conclusion was really kind of curious, and as we go through this, I'll tell you what my results were. And of course, my dissertation was accepted and published, and the rest is history. You can find it someplace on the internet. Um, I did not copyright it, so it's out there. So if you want to look it up, you can look it up. It's kind of long. You probably don't want to see it. I certainly don't want to read it anyway. It's really kind of curious. Okay, so that's me. That's my research. Good research must begin with a good research question. Coming up with a good research question is something that novice researchers often find difficult and stressful. And of course, was having problems as well. At one point, I thought I would do research with boarding schools and to see what impact boarding schools had on some of my students. But the boarding schools up in Montana were a little bit different. Most of them were in the area. They had two boarding schools in the area. One was run by the Catholic Church, and the other was run by the government, but it was on the reservation. So, and the students weren't. It was residential, but their parents could come and see them anytime. It was the same way with the Catholic school on the southern part of the reservation. So that really didn't work out very well. Some kids were taken to Sisseton Wahpeton. There was a school out there in South Dakota, um, but nobody went out to Carlisle. Nobody went to Chilocco. Nobody went that far away. It is largely the product of ordinary thinking strategies and persistence. That's according to Weisberg in 1993. Research questions often begin as more general research ideas, usually focusing on some behavior or psychological characteristic. Three of the most common sources of inspiration are informal observations, practical problems, and previous research. Well, there was no previous research on resilience with indigenous people, but my informal observations showed me that I had all of these colleagues and all these friends on the reservation, and resilience seemed to be uh, they had survived. Certainly, they had survived up to that point. So um, it was an informal observation as far as I was concerned. Informal observations include direct observations of our own and others' behavior, as well as secondhand observations from non scientific sources such as newspapers, books, blogs, and so on. Some of the most famous research in psychology has been inspired by informal observations. Stanley Milgram's famous research on obedience to authority, for example, was inspired in part by journalistic reports of the trials of accused Nazi war criminals, many of whom claimed that they were only obeying orders. This led him to wonder about the extent to which ordinary people will commit immoral acts simply because they are ordered to do so, or to do so by an authority figure. And of course, this is the famous Milgram experiment, where he had people shocking an individual. And this is him holding his arm down to an electric plate to shock him if he gets the answer wrong. And the question was, do people really do that? Will they follow instructions, even though it seems like it doesn't make a lot of sense and that it's immoral? And the answer was, yeah, about 65% of them did. At first, he did it with males, then he did it with females, and what he discovered was 65% of the females did it too. So they followed the authority figure as well. Practical problems can also inspire research ideas, leading directly to applied research. Probably the most common inspiration for new research ideas is previous research. Science is a kind of large-scale collaboration in which many different researchers read and evaluate each other's work and conduct new studies to build on it. Novice researchers can find inspiration by consulting with a more experienced researcher. They can find inspiration by picking up a copy of almost any professional journal and reading the titles and the abstracts. One of the most common sources of inspiration is previous research. It is important to review the literature early in the research process. The research literature in any field is all of the published research in that field. Reviewing the research literature means finding, reading, and summarizing the published research relevant to your topic of interest. In addition to helping you discover new research questions, reviewing the literature early in the research process can help you in several other ways. It can tell you if a research question has already been answered. It can help you evaluate the interestingness of a research question. It can give you ideas for how to conduct your own study. It can tell you how your study fits into the research literature. Research literature consists almost entirely of two types of sources: articles in professional journals and scholarly books in psychology and related fields. Now, the difference is, and this is one of the things that you need to remember, if somebody publishes something in a book, it takes that book a long time to be printed. It takes that book a long time to be put together. So potentially, if you find something in a scholarly book, it's dated. Humans change a lot, and they change very, very rapidly. And so finding something in a scholarly book is a bit of a trick. You're more likely to find something in a professional journal. As a matter of fact, I have a discussion question for you that comes out of a June 2024 book printed by the APA, a magazine printed by the APA. And I will give you, if I can figure out how to do it, I will give you that article and you can read it. It's about indigenous research, and it's really kind of fascinating. Can we put that in a book? Sure, we can put that in a book, but how long is it going to take for them to publish that book? The article came out in June of 2024. You know, we don't print the same books every week. We print them every 2 or 3 years, and that's one of the reasons why professional journals are a little bit more up to date than scholarly books. Professional journals are periodicals that publish original research articles. There are thousands of professional journals that publish research in psychology and related fields. They are usually published monthly or quarterly in individual issues, each of which contains several articles. And this is an example. These are all APA. I think they're APA. American Psychologist is the magazine, as the journal of the American Psychological Association. Gets really kind of curious. APA is one organization. The APS is the organization of the cognitive psychologists, and that stands for American Psychological Scientific Organization, I guess. Anyway, so if you run into a cognitive psychologist and you mention the APA, they'll stick their nose up in the air and go, I don't read that stuff. I just read my APS journals. The issues are organized into volumes, which usually consist of all the issues for a calendar year. Some journals are published in hard copy only, others in both hard copy and electronic form, and still others in electronic form only. When I did my dissertation in 2000, there were very few databases, so most of my research came out of the library. I had to go to the library to find all this stuff. So at that time, of course, we were looking for journals, and journals were published in hard copy. Anyway, where was I? Oh, I was up in Montana, and of course, finding there were no colleges there. College few and far between. Some of the libraries were pretty crappy up there, but I had to go to Indiana University, visit my parents, and go to Indiana University to find some of this information. Most articles in professional journals are one of two basic types: empirical research reports and review articles. Empirical research reports describe one or more new empirical studies conducted by the authors. They introduce a research question, explain why it is interesting, review previous research, describe their method and results, and draw their conclusions. These are empirical research reports. Now, in the future, well, maybe, I don't know. Anyway, I'm not going to be teaching anymore, but what I have my students do is article critiques. And when I have them do article critiques, I have to do an article critique about a research article. Well, this is what they have to find, all this stuff. That's what they're looking for. Of course, they don't have to read it all because some of it is the same stuff over and over and over again. What you're looking for the research question, you're looking for the method and the results, especially the population, because sometimes people are doing research on a population of 21-year-old college students. How representative are they of everybody else? And the answer is not very representative. Anyway, and then you need to find the conclusion as well. Review articles summarize previously published research on a topic and usually present new ways to organize or explain the results. Review articles, you cannot do an article critique on a review article, mainly because it doesn't talk about specific research. When a review article is devoted primarily to presenting a new theory, it is often referred to as a theoretical article. And of course, it's an information article. It isn't a research article. However, if you want to do an article critique and you want to do one for me, and actually I have the people in Psych 360, psychopharmacology, I have them do an article critique dealing with each and every drug that we talk about. I want them to use either empirical research articles or meta-analyses. Meta-analyses looks at several different empirical research reports and it puts it together, and that's okay. You can do an article critique on a meta-analysis. You can do an article critique on an empirical research report, but you cannot do an article critique on a review article or a theoretical article. When a review article provides a statistical summary, well, that's not a review article. Meta-analysis is looking at a series of empirical research reports. And it will talk about the populations that they looked at. It will talk about the methods that they used. And it will talk about the results they discovered. Once you have a research idea, you need to use it to generate one or more empirically testable research questions. That is, questions expressed in terms of a single variable or relationship between variables. If you have a particular behavior or psychological characteristic in mind, you can simply conceptualize it as a variable and ask how frequent or intense it is. If the question has never been studied scientifically, then it might be interesting and worth pursuing. If scientific research has already answered the question or how frequent or intense the behavior or a characteristic is, then you should consider turning it into a question about a relationship between that behavior or characteristic and some other variable. One way to do this is to ask yourself the following series of more general questions and write down all the answers you can think of. What are some possible causes of the behavior or characteristic? What are some possible effects of the behavior or characteristic? What types of people might exhibit more or less the behavior of or characteristic? What types of situations might elicit more or less of the behavior or characteristic? Researchers usually generate many more research questions than they ever attempt to answer. But a research question should be interesting to us personally, to people more generally, and especially to the scientific community. A research question is interesting to the extent that that its answer is in doubt. Will the research question fill a gap in the research literature? Does a research question's answers have important practical implications? An important criterion for evaluating research questions is the feasibility of successfully answering them. There are many factors that affect feasibility, including time, money, equipment and materials, technical knowledge and skill, and access to research participants. Researchers need to take these factors into account so that they do not waste time and effort pursuing research that they cannot complete successfully. And that's what feasibility has to do with. Do you have the time to do it? Do you have the money to do it? Do you have the equipment to do it? Do you have the materials to do it? Do you have the technical knowledge and the skill to get it done? Do you have access to research participants? Feasibility. If you don't have the research participants, how are you going to do it? If you don't have the money to do it, how are you going to do it? If you don't have the time to do it, or the equipment, or the technical knowledge and skill, if you need to do an MRI and you don't have an MRI machine, guess what? You're not going to be able to do it. Keep in mind that research does not have to be complicated or difficult to produce interesting and important results. It is generally good practice to use methods that have already been used successfully by other researchers. This is good not only for the sake of feasibility, the approach is tried and true, but also because it provides greater continuity with previous research. This makes it easier to compare your results with those of other researchers and to understand the implications of their research for yours and vice versa. Now, this is really kind of interesting. So what I did when I did my research, I found a trauma scale that had already been used and already been standardized. I used a cultural scale that had already been used and already been standardized. I used a resilience scale that had already been used and already been standardized. Why? Because I didn't want, if I created my own, I would have to prove that it actually measured what I said it measured. But since I used instruments that other people had already used, I didn't have to do that. It had already been standardized. You can come up with your own instrument if you want, but how do you know that instrument actually tells you what you say it tells you? So if you use an instrument that somebody else has already standardized, somebody else has already proven it measures what you say it measures, then you don't have to do that. You don't have to write your own questions. Before describing how to develop a hypothesis, it is important to distinguish between a theory and a hypothesis. A theory is a coherent explanation or interpretation of one or more phenomena. Although theories can take a variety of forms, one thing that they have in common is that they go beyond the phenomena. They explain by concluding variables, structures, processes, functions, or organizing principles that have not been observed directly. A theory is simply an explanation or interpretation of a set of phenomena. A hypothesis is a specific prediction about a new phenomenon that should be observed if a particular theory is accurate. It is an explanation that relies on just a few key concepts. Hypotheses are often specific predictions about what will happen in a particular study. They are developed by considering existing evidence and using reasoning to infer what will happen in the specific context of interest. The hypothesis is often a prediction based on a theory, but some hypotheses are atheoretical, and only after a set of observations have been made is a theory developed. This is because theories are broad in nature and they explain larger bodies of data. There are three general characteristics of a good hypothesis. A good hypothesis must be testable and falsifiable. We must be able to test the hypothesis using the methods of science. And if you'll recall Popper's falsifiability criterion, which I didn't talk about, I apologize, it must be possible to gather evidence that will disconfirm the hypothesis if it is indeed false. And that's one of the differences between a scientist and a pseudoscientist. A scientist always looks at whether his information, his method can be proven to be incorrect. He's always looking to make sure that that not only is his hypothesis correct, but he's also trying to disprove it at the same time. And we'll talk about this when we talk about the null hypothesis. So it has to be falsifiable. In other words, you have to look at the fact that this may not be true. It may not have been true. My hypothesis was that the indigenous population on the Fort Belknap Reservation were resilient. That was my hypothesis. I could show that they were resilient. But at the same time, I had to equally try to prove that they were not resilient. I had to test to falsify my idea, and that was one of the reasons it took me so long to get it approved to do it on the reservation, which I actually never got approved to do it, and I didn't do it on the reservation. And now we're getting into the dark area of my research. I couldn't do it on the reservation, so I had to do it off the reservation. But like I said, I had lots of friends off the reservation who were indigenous. They were from the two different tribes. There were also people off the reservation from a third tribe that were landless, an indigenous people. They've been recognized now. I'm trying to think what that group was. They were a Chippewa Cree tribe. What am I talking about? I'm talking about hypothesis. So it has to be testable and it has to be falsifiable. A good hypothesis must be logical. Hypotheses should be informed by previous theories of observations and logical reasoning. Typically, we begin with a broad and general theory and use deductive reasoning to generate a more specific hypothesis to test based on that theory. The hypothesis should be positive. That is, the hypothesis should make a positive statement about the existence of a relationship or effect, rather than a statement that is a relationship or effect that does not exist. It has to exist. It has to be positive. And that's what I did. I was talking about resilience. Part of the generating a hypothesis involves identifying the variables that you want to study and operationally defining these variables so that they can be measured. You have to define them, each and every one of them. Research questions in psychology are about variables. A variable is a quantity or a quality that varies across people or situations. Now my variables, I had 6 variables. I had resilience was one variable. I had cultural awareness was a second variable. My third variable had to do with level of trauma that they had experienced in their lives, uh, level of education that they had, their gender, and their, what was my third? What was my sixth one? Education, gender, and age. Okay. Okay. Variables can be either quantitative or categorical. My quantitative ones had to do with education, had to do with age, had to do with resilience, trauma, and culture. But my categorical one had to do with gender. And I was only recognizing 2 different genders. So, and this was back in the early 2000s. So I didn't run into anybody that got angry with me about that. A categorical variable is a quality, and of course, being male or female is a quality. It's not quantifiable. I'm, 40% male and 60% female. No, 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 no. It's a quality. You're either male or female. Now, of course, we have other categories. The researcher needs to explain what and how they are able to, how they're going to define and measure their variables, which requires an operational definition. And that's what I did. I defined my culture by a select survey. I defined the amount of trauma with a select survey. I defined my resilience with a select survey, and of course, the categorical one, the gender was specific. Operational definition of age had to do with how many years you've been alive. Education was how many years been you had been schooled. So if you graduated from high school, that was 12 years. If you had a bachelor's degree, that's 16 years, probably. If you had an associate degree, that's 14 years. PhD, it's 21 years or whatever. Most variables that researchers are interested in studying cannot be directly observed or measured, and this poses a problem because empiricism, observation, is at the heart of the scientific method. Operationally, defining a variable involves taking an abstract construct like depression that cannot be directly observed and transforming it into something that can be directly observed and measured. And of course, the example of depression, how do you measure depression? On a scale of 1 to 10, well, there's Beck's depression inventory that most people use to measure depression. Most variables can be operationally defined in many different ways. Researchers are wise to choose an operational definition that has been used extensively in the research literature, and that's what I did. My 3 surveys that I used for trauma, for level of culture, and for resilience were all measurements that had been used many, many times. And of course, that all was in my literature review for the trauma, the culture, and resilience. An operational definition is a detailed description that defines a measure to such a degree that everyone collects data the same way. The number of sandwiches, the total number of items with something delicious between 2 slices of bread, does that fit? Sure, you got this sandwich, this sandwich, this sandwich. Is that a sandwich? And the answer is yes, it is. Because it's something delicious between 2 slices of bread. Well, I don't like lobsters, but if you like lobsters or crawdads or whatever that is, could be a shrimp, I guess. Big one. Researchers need to identify the population of interest. Researchers in psychology are usually interested in drawing conclusions about some very large group of people, and this is called the population. So my population were the indigenous populations that lived in Blaine, and I can't remember the other name of the other county, but all the indigenous people that lived in that area that didn't include the reservation, because I couldn't do my research on the reservation. They wouldn't let me do it. So I had to choose people that lived off the reservation who were indigenous. But of course, when you're dealing with two such large counties, and they were the size of each county was the size of Delaware. There are a lot of people that live on the reservation, but there were a lot of indigenous people who lived off the reservation to work mostly. They usually study only a small subset or sample of the population, and this is what I did. My population were the indigenous people that lived in these two counties, and my sample were the people that lived off the reservation that I identified by their names, interestingly enough. Did I miss some people off the reservation? Probably, but all the names that I used were names that were common on the reservation. I mean, in your case, you would have the probably the most common names on the Navajo Nation are Begay, Nez, and Yazi. I'm sure there's a ton of others, but that's fairly obvious who has indigenous ancestry from just the last name. And of course, this worked because the county wasn't, neither county was that large. I think they had, Blaine County had 1.4 people per square mile. That's how big. It was a big county with not very many people there. And I was able to find, I don't know, 150 people who had names that I identified as indigenous, and so I was wrong sometimes. There were Johnsons on the reservation who were not, and I probably missed some people who were female individuals who were indigenous who had married individuals that didn't have indigenous last names. Anyway, that was my sample. It was interesting. It is important for researchers to use a representative sample, one that is similar to the population in important respects. And I can't really say that I did that since people on the reservation were a little bit different than people off the reservation. For one thing, they made less money on the reservation than off the reservation because most of the indigenous people living off the reservation had better jobs. There weren't that many jobs on the reservation. There weren't very many jobs in the area anyway. One method of obtaining a sample is simple random sampling, in which every member of the population has an equal chance of being selected for the sample. Unfortunately, the random sampling is difficult or impossible in most psychological research because the populations aren't clearly defined. The most common alternative to random sampling is convenience sampling, in which the sample consists of individuals who happen to be nearby and willing to participate, and that's what they've done here. The obvious problems with convenience sampling is that the sample might not be representative of the population, and therefore it may be less appropriate to generalize the results from the sample to that population. Researchers who want to test hypotheses, what I did a census sample. So I sent letters to everybody that had a common name that was common on the reservation. I sent everybody a letter. So I actually did a census sample. In other words, I hit everybody off the reservation, and it turned out to be, I think I sent out 150, I got like 125 back or something like that. It's all in my dissertation. Researchers who want to test hypotheses have causal relationships between variables. In other words, their goal is to explain to need to use an experimental method. This is because the experimental method is the only method that allows us to determine causal relationships. Using the experimental approach, researchers first manipulate one or more variables while attempting to control extraneous variables, and then they measure how the manipulated variables affect participants' responses. And this is an example of all the, yeah, so the results are specific. The researchers have stronger hold over the variables because they control everything. The subject or the industry does not impact the effectiveness of the experimental research. Any industry can implement it for research purposes. After analyzing the results, you can apply your findings to similar ideas or situations. You can identify the cause and effect of a hypothesis. Researchers further analyze this relationship to determine more in-depth ideas. The data that you collect is the foundation of which you build more ideas and conduct more research. And so experimental researchers, you can see they're all smiling. So they've all got they think that they've got absolute answers. The terms independent variable and dependent variable are used in the context of experimental research. The independent variable is the variable the experimenter manipulates, and it is the presumed cause. And the dependent variable is the variable that the experimenter measures. It is the presumed effect. Okay, in my case, I had my independent variables were trauma, age, gender, uh, education, and culture. Those were my independent variables. And my dependent variable was resilience. So I was comparing resilience to all of these different things, all my different independent variables. Extraneous variables are any variable other than the dependent variable. So my independent variables were also extraneous variables. Confounds are a specific type of extraneous variable that systematically varies along with the variables under investigation and therefore provides an alternative explanation for the results. Confounding variables would include, in my case, spirituality. I didn't measure spirituality. It was confounding variables. Was that something that was important? Should I have measured spirituality? Somebody suggested that I measured spirituality, but I didn't have a measurement to use to measure spirituality. And not only that, but on the Fort Belknap Reservation, arguments about traditionalism and different forms of Christianity. There was the southern part of the reservation was Catholic. There was a evangelical church that was on the Fort Belknap College campus. They called it the Log Church, but it was an evangelical church. It was really kind of weird. And of course, there were traditionalists, and there was the more established Catholic Church. But the people at this evangelical church, if you had an indigenous last name, there were people on the reservation. Stiff Arms was a popular name. Talks different. Donies. If you had a indigenous last name, they didn't capitalize their last name because they were evangelicals and they thought it was sinful. As stupid as all that sounds, well, it's not really for me to say. It's their religion. Anyway, so I didn't want to get into spirituality because I didn't want to compare Catholics with more traditional people with especially the evangelicals. They were interesting people. Anyway, that could potentially have been a confounding variable, but I didn't measure it because I was looking at something else, and I didn't want to deal with the fallout of identifying people's spirituality. Wouldn't that have been a mess? Researchers who are simply interested in describing characteristics of people, describing relationships between variables, and using those relationships to make predictions can use non-experimental research. Using the non-experimental approach, the researcher simply measures variables as they naturally occur, but they do not manipulate them. It is important to point out that non-experimental does not mean non-scientific. Non-experimental research is scientific in nature. It can be used to fulfill two of the three goals of science: to describe and to predict. However, unlike with experimental research, we cannot make causal conclusions using this method. We cannot say that one variable causes another variable using this method. And of course, my research was not experimental. The next major distinction between research methods is between laboratory and field studies. A laboratory study is a study that is conducted in the laboratory environment. A field study is a study that is conducted in the real world, in a natural environment, and mine was a field study. Laboratory experiments typically have high internal validity. Internal validity refers to the degree to which we can confidently infer a causal relationship between variables. When we conduct an experimental study in a laboratory environment, we have very high internal validity because we manipulate one variable while controlling all other outside extraneous variables. When we manipulate an independent variable and observe an effect on a dependent variable, and we control for everything else so that the only difference between our experimental groups or conditions is the one manipulated variable, that we can be quite confident that it is the independent variable that is causing the change in the dependent variable. In contrast, because field studies are conducted in the real world, the experimenter typically has less control over the environment and potential extraneous variables, and this decreases internal validity, making it less appropriate to arrive at causal conclusions. Internal validity, laboratory experiments, we can predict causal, we can make causal conclusions. Internal validity, high internal validity. There is typically a trade-off between internal and external validity. External validity simply refers to the degree to which we can generalize the findings to other circumstances or settings, like the real-world environment. When internal validity is high, external validity tends to be low. And when internal validity is low, external validity tends to be high. So laboratory studies are typically low in external validity, while field studies are typically high in external validity. Since field studies are conducted in the real-world environment, it is far more appropriate to generalize the findings to that real-world environment than when the research is conducted in the more artificial, sterile laboratory. And there's a reason why I put this picture here. I like this, I like this skull. It doesn't mean anything. I just like the skull. I thought it was cool. There's these carotid arteries. Once the study is complete and the observations have been made and recorded, the researchers need to analyze the data and draw their conclusions. Typically, data are analyzed using both descriptive and inferential statistics. Descriptive statistics are used to summarize the data. Inferential statistics are used to make conclusions about whether or not a theory has been supported, refuted, or requires modification. And of course, the last two chapters that we're going to be looking at, the 12th chapter is descriptive statistics, and the 13th chapter is inferential statistics. You don't need to understand statistics. I can explain all this stuff to you. And I'm going to start right now. But I don't have a dancing computer. What am I going to do? Descriptive statistics are used to organize or summarize a set of data. Percentages, measures of central tendency, the mean, median, and mode, measures of dispersion, range, standard deviation, and variance, and correlation coefficients. Measures of central tendency are used to describe the typical average and center of a distribution of scores. The mode is the most frequently occurring score in a distribution. Most frequently occurring score in this case is 6. That's the mode. The median is the midpoint of a distribution of scores. And in this case, the median is also 6 because there are 3 numbers to the right and 3 numbers to the left. It's 6. The mean is the average of a distribution of scores. And if we add all those up and divide by 7, yes, by 7, we get 5. So the mean is 5. Okay. Anyway. Measures of dispersion are also considered descriptive statistics. They are used to describe the degree of spread in a set of scores. The range is the measure of dispersion that measures the distance between the highest and the lowest scores in a distribution. And in this one, the lowest is 1 and the highest is 8. So the range would be 7. 8 minus 1 equals 7. That would be the range. The standard deviation is a more sophisticated measure of dispersion. It measures the average distance of scores from the mean. The variance is just the standard deviation squared. And this is a formula for standard deviation, and we'll go through this later. It's kind of a goofy thing. You take the mean and you subtract whatever the number is. So in this case, the mean is 5. So you subtract 1 from 5 and you get 4. You subtract 3 from 5, you get 2. You subtract 4 from 5, you get 1. You subtract 6 from 5, you get minus 1. You get minus 1, minus 2, and minus 3. And then you square all that. So they're all positive numbers. Minus times a minus is a positive, of course. Then you add all of those up and divide by the number. You add all those up and then you square it, and then you divide it by the number of numbers. In this case, it's 7. There are 7 numbers. And that's your standard deviation. As weird as that sounds. And then variance is you just square it. In other words, you take the number, just take the standard deviation and square it. Multiply it times itself. And that's your variance. So it also measures the distance of scores from the mean, but in a different unit of measure. And we'll talk about that when we talk about descriptive statistics. It's not as hard as it looks. And there is a logic to it. For non-experimental research, simple percentages may be computed to describe the percentage of people who engaged in some behavior or held some belief. But more commonly, non-experimental research involves computing the correlation between two variables. A correlation coefficient describes the strength and the direction of the relationship between two variables. The values of a correlation coefficient can range from -1, that's the strongest possible negative relationship, to +1, the strongest possible positive relationship. A value of 0 means there is no relationship between the two variables. Positive correlation coefficients indicate that as the values of one variable increases, so do the values of the other variable. The negative correlation coefficients indicate that as the value of one variable increase, the values of the other variable decrease. Okay, let me give you an example and see if I can confuse you even more. So let's say that my hypothesis is that peanut butter cures migraine headaches. That's my hypothesis. Okay, so I force feed 100 people. What am I feeding them? Oh, peanut butter for 30 days. And I'm measuring the number of migraine headaches they have. So let's say that peanut butter really does cure migraine headaches, and I only have 11. I have 11 migraine headaches. So I get a correlation coefficient of +89. let's say the peanut butter actually causes migraine headaches. So as the amount of peanut butter I give them actually increases the number of migraine headaches they have, and in which case then the correlation coefficient, and we have 90 people that have migraine headaches. We have 90 people, so that would be a correlation coefficient of -9.9. -0.9. Okay, So we've got 0.9 and we have negative 0.9, which is a negative correlation, and we have a positive 8.9. Okay, that's assuming that we only get one number. We don't get both numbers at the same time. One is if peanut butter actually causes migraine headaches. The other is if it actually cures migraine headaches. So which is higher, 0.9 or minus 0.9 or positive 0.89? The answer is the minus 0.9 is higher because it's a higher number. So the larger the number, the more the more likely that is the cause of what's going on. Okay. So what if we had 50? What if we had 50 out of, so does peanut butter have anything to do with it? If we had a zero correlation coefficient, and of course this is done with statistics, but if we had a zero, that would mean there's no correlation between peanut butter and migraine headaches. If it causes migraine headaches, then it's a positive number. If it doesn't cause migraine headaches, that's not right. If it causes migraine headaches, it's a negative number. If it cures migraine headaches, it's a positive number. If it doesn't have anything to do with migraine headaches, it's closer to zero. Okay, a value of zero means that no relationship between the two there's no relationship between the two variables. Positive correlation coefficients indicate that as the values of one variable increase, so do the values of the other. That's what happened with my theory was that it cured migraine headaches. So the more positive it was, the more correct my hypothesis was. A negative correlation coefficient indicates that as the value of one variable increases, the values of the other variable decreases. And so as the number of migraine headaches increased with the amount of peanut butter that I gave them, of course, that's when I came up with the negative 0.9. I hope I've confused you terribly. It actually makes a lot of sense. And when we go through this with descriptive statistics, then it'll all make a lot more sense. Researchers sample from a population, but ultimately they want to be able to generalize their results from the sample to a broader population. Researchers typically want to infer that the population is like-based on the sample that they studied. Inferential statistics are used for that purpose. Inferential statistics allow researchers to draw conclusions about a population based on data from a sample. Inferential statistics are crucial because of the effects, i.e. the differences in the means or the correlation coefficient, that researchers find in a study may be due simply to random chance variability, or they may be due to a real effect. For example, they may reflect a real relationship between variables or a real effect of an independent variable on a dependent variable. Okay. So inferential statistics are things like t-tests and p-tests and ANOVAs and MANOVAs. Those are inferential statistics. We're trying to find out if there was an error in the, that's what a t-test does. It tells us if there is an error in, if it was just a random thing, that there was a difference. Researchers use inferential statistics to determine whether their effects are statistically significant. A statistically significant effect is one that is unlikely due to random chance and therefore likely represents a real effect in the population. Remember that correlation coefficient when we got a zero? That's statistically insignificant. In other words, significance is a larger number. And we have to determine what that number potentially has to be in order to be statistically significant. This gets really interesting when you're starting to do original research, because you have to decide how strong your number has to be in order to be statistically significant. This gets really weird because when I did my research, there was only one independent variable that affected resilience. Remember, I was measuring resilience, trauma, level of culture, age, gender, and education. I was measuring all those things against resilience. And there was only one factor, one independent variable that affected resilience, my resilience score. And I'll talk about that in just a minute. More specifically, results that have less than a 5% chance of being due to random error are typically considered statistically significant. When an effect is statistically significant, it is appropriate to generalize the results from the sample to the population. In contrast, if inferential statistics reveal that there is more than a 5% chance that the effect could be due to chance error alone, that the researcher must conclude that their result is not statistically significant. And that's what we're looking for. We're looking for statistical significance so that we can, when we talk about resilience, we can talk about this is what affects resilience. These other things have no effect on them. Mistakes can always be made. Specifically, two kinds of mistakes can be made. Researchers can make a type 1 error, which is a false positive. It is when a researcher concludes that their results are statistically significant, so they say there is an effect in the population, when in reality there is no effect on the population and the results are just due to chance. They are a fluke. When the threshold is set to 5%, which is the convention, then the researcher has a 5% chance or less of making a type 1 error. Type 2 errors is a missed opportunity. It is when a researcher concludes that their results are not statistically significant, when in reality there is a real effect in the population and they just missed detecting it. Type 2 errors are more likely to occur when the threshold is set too low, for example, set at 1% instead of 5%, or when the sample was too small. And this is the biggest problem, isn't the fact that the threshold was set too low. Usually it is the fact that their sample is too small. Okay, type 1 errors and type 2 errors. Now here's an easy way to remember it. Type 1 error, he says that this man is pregnant. Probably not. Type 2 error, this obviously pregnant lady, she says she's not pregnant. Type 2 error is a negative error. Type 1 error is a false positive. This is a false negative. Okay. So type 1 errors are false positives. Your pregnancy test was positive. Type 2 errors are false negatives. Your pregnancy test was negative, even though you're obviously 6 months along. Since statistics are probabilistic in nature and findings can reflect type 1 or type 2 errors, we cannot use the results of a single study to conclude with certainty that a theory is true. Rather, theories are supported, refuted, or modified based on the results of the research. They are big maybes. If the results are statistically significant and consistent with the hypothesis and the theory that was used to generate the hypothesis, then researchers can conclude that the theory is supported. Confirming a hypothesis can strengthen a theory, but it can never prove a theory. Avoiding claiming proof is because the result may reflect a type 1 error. One cannot definitively prove a general principle just by observing confirming cases, no matter how many. It is always possible that a disconfirming case will eventually come along. For these reasons, scientists tend to think of theories, even highly successful theories, as subject to revision based on new and unexpected observations, because humanity changes so frequently. There's no way of proving any of the theories in psychology. According to the strictest version of the hypothetico-deductive method, disconfirming a hypothesis disproves the theory it was derived from. But in practice, scientists do not give up on their theories so easily. One disconfirmed hypothesis could be a missed opportunity, the result of a type 2 error, or it could be the result of a faulty research design. And usually that's the assumption. We made a mistake. It's a bad research design. Possibly the researcher did not successfully manipulate the independent variable or measure the dependent variable correctly. Because statistics are probabilistic in nature and because all research studies have flaws, there is no such thing as scientific proof. There is only scientific evidence. So there is no proving research. Boom. The most prestigious way to report one's finding is by writing a manuscript and having it published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. Another way to report findings is by writing a book chapter that is published in an edited book. A researcher can disseminate findings by giving a presentation at a conference. This can either be done as an oral presentation or as a poster presentation. Now you are probably curious as to what happened in my research. As I said, only one of my independent variables was statistically significant as far as resilience was concerned, and that turned out to be um, your cultural awareness. The strength of your cultural awareness was significantly uh, significant, was statistically significant, and it was the higher the cultural awareness, the stronger the resilience. That was the one thing that was statistically significant. Now the other thing is that trauma had no effect on resilience. Now in most populations, this is weird because in most populations, where they did it in Germany, where they did it in Africa, where they used the same resilience measurement that I did, uh, the higher the trauma, the lower the resilience rate. But this was the third research looking at trauma and resilience in indigenous populations that showed that the level of trauma had nothing to do with the level of resilience. Even though in the white population, in the African population, in the Hispanic population, and other populations, the more trauma people had, the lower their resilience rate. But with American Indians, they did one of the pieces of research was done on the Navajo Nation, another was done with the Hopi, and mine, of course, was done with Northern Plains tribes. Trauma had nothing to do with, did not lower the resilience rate. So those were the two important findings in my research. There you go. Okay, so next week we'll talk about ethics and research designs. So have fun. I will publish all of this stuff later, and everybody will be happy.